Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again today. It's June 10th, and I'd like to welcome you to the second session of the second season of COVID Conversations Symposium, brought to you by Ready for Black Lives. And so we are always broadcasting on Indigenous land in what is known as Canada. And we're thankful that you're joining us today. Ready for Black Lives is an organization that is invested in informing people across these territories and the world about the threats and opportunities of AI tech to our health and collective well-being. And today we are going to be talking with Melissa McCraden, and today's session is titled AI in Clinical Care When Good Intentions Aren't Enough. And so before we begin anything, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And then I will introduce our speaker who is joining us today, and then we will proceed through questions. And please do develop your questions and feel free to put them in, and we will answer them as we can after we have engaged our speaker today. And so in this land acknowledgement, we'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which I'm speaking from today and acknowledge the caretakers of this land. This is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Huron-Wendat nations. It is critical that we not only acknowledge Canada's settler colonial history and present and our own positions on this land, but that we must stop the wheels of colonization and occupation in its tracks. The gross disrespects for Indigenous life, Indigenous nations, and land stop because we make it stop. Please contact your premiers, your prime minister, and flood them with your concerns as unrelentingly as Indigenous peoples have been flooded with settler ideas. And so we ask you to work together as treaty people to protect Indigenous life. And in support and recognition, I'd like to highlight 3 people. There are so many more, but I would like to make sure that we speak to Regis Korchinski-Paquette, who died May 27th of 2020 at 29 years old. She's an Indigenous Ukrainian Black Canadian woman who was alive when the police arrived and fell to her death in their presence and still waiting for peace, because without justice, there is no peace. And so our hearts go out to the Regis Korchinski-Paquette family as they continue to struggle to get justice for their daughter and family. And Joy Ekwon, a 37-year-old Indigenous woman who died on September 28th, 2020 in a hospital where she should have been getting care, but instead was getting anything but. Our hearts go out to Joy Ekwon's family. Ms. Ekwon left behind children, a partner, and a vibrant community. We are deeply saddened that this continues and that people with important positions and power have not yielded to the truth. And our hearts are with you, and we will continue to push from the outside. This occurred because clinicians had the opportunity to intervene on Joy Ekwon's behalf and treat her as an honored patient. But that did not happen in St. Charles, Bromé, Quebec. And of course, we would like to recognize the 215 Indigenous children at one of Canada's largest residential schools. There are many yet to be found and repatriated to their homes, and our hearts go out across this country to British Columbia, but to the many unknown and unmarked graves that are yet to be excavated and have their loved ones repatriated. May you all rest in power and peace. And without justice, there cannot be peace. And so I'd like to take a moment of silence today. Before we go further. And now, I'd like to introduce you to our guest today, which is Melissa McCraden. And she's going to be talking with us about her work as a bioethicist. Hi, Melissa.
Hi.
Before we go any further in, I want to make sure I give you an introduction. So for folks that don't know Melissa McCraden, she's a bioethicist at the Hospital for Sick Children and an assistant professor at the Alawana School of Public Health and a mom of 2 wonderful children. She holds a PhD in neuroscience from McMaster University and a master's in bioethics at University of Toronto. She was the inaugural postdoctoral fellow in ethics of AI in healthcare with SickKids and Vector Institute. Her work in ethics healthcare, and machine learning aims to explore ways to prevent harm, prioritize justice, and critically consider evidence-based practices surrounding the implementation of technology. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you.
And so the session today is AI in clinical care when good intentions aren't enough. The reason we've invited you here today, Melissa, is because so often people ask us at Ready for Black Lives, is there an example of somewhere where it's gone right? And unfortunately, as we all know in the field, that's not so easy to find. And so I happened to be checking in with you and, in preparation for this. And I asked, what projects are going on? Can you tell me about them? And, you talking about your project, and there was this little one. I was like, can you reverse and tell me about that one? You're like, oh, okay. And it's an excellent example of when things are going in the better direction. And so I want to ask you about that project as an example. So folks, if you've tuned in today because you're like, well, what is a good example? How do we differentiate? There must be something good going on, and there is. But before we do that, we're going to ask a little bit about how Melissa got here. How did you get to the field of bioethics? What brought you in and allowed you to be the inaugural postdoctoral fellow in AI and ethics?
Yeah, I think I had a bit of a convoluted road to get here, actually, because I started in neuroscience. I was interested in brain disease and thinking about ways to help people through it. And one of the things, as I was kind of going down my journey, was I was considering applying to medical school, actually. And part of that involved reading about bioethics in preparation for the test. And as I was reading through it, I was really drawn to the idea that the right thing to do is not always like the most scientifically valid thing to do or the thing that is most accurate to do. That there's really this larger consideration of the values that are at stake and whose values get represented within science, within medicine. And so what I loved about the field initially was the way that you could bring together ideas about evidence, about our knowledge, about different forms of knowledge, and about values and moral behavior, to try and find, what is the best way forward here. And so that was the reason I started to pursue a master's in bioethics. And along the way, I was working with some folks who were doing machine learning at my first postdoc in St. Mike's. And one of the biggest topics was algorithmic bias. And I'm really, really fortunate to have worked with some really amazing people who I really credit to kind of pointing me in the right direction, because my whole journey started from a perspective of looking at the work of Black scholars, of Indigenous scholars. And so that was where I started. And as I kind of moved through that field, the things that I was learning about algorithmic bias, it really became clear that this is not an AI thing, this is an everything thing. And so I tried to kind of bring that lens more broadly to other areas of practice in medicine and bioethics. And I guess that's kind of how I'm here today.
Okay, I like that it's an everything thing. Can we kind of go back to that? So what do you mean when you say that it's an everything thing? I assume you're referring to ethics, bioethics, and AI, or clarify for us.
Yeah, I think it's the world, it's settler Canada, it's the space in which we operate, it's the values that we think are neutral but are not. I think that was something that, came to the realization about it. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like you realize you're in the Matrix, and, you start confronting the fact that the space in which I live, at least, was characterized by white supremacy. And you start to see how those values are embedded in all these little ways. And so I really started to be more aware of how algorithmic bias is really kind of it's reflective of the larger whole. And so right off the bat, the answers that were presented to me for algorithmic bias were toward the structures and the systems that were in place. And so when I say, like, I realized it was an everything thing, it's because that's what was pointed out to me by these scholars. And you really start to examine that and see kind of how the world is characterized in such a way.
I want to thank you for that. So often the conversation about artificial intelligence and bioethics is a conversation that positions what we see as the quote natural order, as if it wasn't man-made and not made by all men and definitely not made for all people, but it's naturalized. And so the kinds of questions that we can ask and the kinds of problems we end up paying attention to solve are not always the ones that are most prioritized to the people who will be most affected. It's often we are directed in our work to attend to the things that are of the interests of the elite and the wealthy and the investors. I mean, if you go to any AI and health conference, some of the stuff you're like, we still don't have really good basic care for a whole swath of patients. Mm-hmm. What are we doing with hundreds of millions of dollars all the way over here? And why is clean water on reserves and why is access to nutritious food not as much a priority as the newfangled things that still require those things to engage? But because the people developing, designing, and thinking are often referred to as elites or have a lot of social capital, the context is not questioned, right? And so one of the reasons I wanted to have you here today is, I had the opportunity to bump into you in the context of bioethics and AI. And I found it very interesting that while the field has spent a lot of time borrowing from ideas of Black and Indigenous scholars, there's also a way in which there's a sleight of hand. So we use language like bias when it's actually discrimination, right? Because the algorithm is designed to do this or that. It's not a maybe. And so discrimination is about this or that. And this technology doesn't lend itself to bias. It simply reproduces discrimination. So even the language is cultured such that we don't interrogate what's before us. So I want to thank you for kind of explicating the everything of everything that artificial intelligence and bioethics are about the lived context. It's not just an abstract theoretical thing. And so that brings me to a question around your education. Can you tell us a little bit about, so we know you've gone through a master's, we know you've gone through a PhD, but generally for the audience who are maybe aspiring or emerging bioethicists, or for your peers who have been at it for ever and a day and can't even remember how the whole thing started, can you give us a little sense of what do you think about the education for bioethicists? You spoke to the fact that there were scholars that were Black and Indigenous that you looked at and whose work informed you. What did you think of the actual education you were offered in becoming a bioethicist? Was it sufficient, or did you have to do that work additionally in order to be competent at this work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that I certainly can't speak for all programs because I did, I did the one and I came to this late. So I don't know what other programs offer, but I know that some of the concerns generally are that the education very often focuses on kind of the core competencies. And so part of that, we know that, the dominant discourse of bioethics has very often reflected white male scholars, often embedded within institutions. And so, a lot of the discourse has been formed in such a way that reflects those interests. And so even thinking about perspectives from feminists and relational scholars, they were always othered in bioethics discourse. And so one of the things that I think that, we are starting to do better, at least was reflective of my education, was feminist perspectives weren't so much othered in the courses that I was offered, that they were core, they were central to a lot of what we were talking about, to the interpretation of these core concepts. And I think that we need to do the same with racial justice, with social justice. I think that those have to not be like the optional modules. Sometimes they're left to the end, or they're brought in, you might have a guest speaker on this. I think that it really needs to be core because, and I draw a lot from Dr. Keisha Ray, who recently had a series in AJOB, which was a series of articles reflecting on bioethics education and thinking through what are the considerations that a clinical ethicist might need when, managing consults or ethical issues which involve racialized persons. And what do we really need to know in order to, be competent in at least, providing good advice or suggesting when our advice maybe isn't enough?
So I wanted to take you down that road just a little bit further. So given what your education has been, in terms of the scope of bioethics, and I'm going to make it a two-part question. So the first part is like, given the scope of your work in bioethics, what you were trained for, what are your reflections on that? Because given that the session is called AI in Clinical Care, When Good Intentions Aren't Enough, part of what I want for folks watching is to actually think with us. So your education, there's definitely some pieces that could be added that would allow you to be more competent and effective. But what about the scope of the work in relationship to the power to do the right thing when it's been identified? And I'll get to the second part. I guess I might as well throw it in now and you can choose to answer it in whatever order. So we have your bioethics education. We have your scope of work, so you can talk a bit about that in terms of what your scope looks like, because bioethics is a diverse field. But then we have the power to actually exercise good judgment, because bioethics is about offering a particular kind of information and feedback, and dare we say, judgment about what's presented before us and what we might interpret it as and what we might do next. And so in AI, we have a hierarchy when it comes to AI, bioethics, and medicine, right? So artificial intelligence comes from the computational world, the world of defense, the world of mathematics, the world of war, the world of science. And bioethics, has also a varied tradition. But there's a hierarchy. So when we're in the clinical space, we know that doctors and chiefs, donors, and boards are at the top of that hierarchy. And bioethicists, maybe not so much. So given the scope of your work, given your education, how do you grapple with the ability to have the right thing happen when it's been parsed, and the power differential within that, right? And then we'll come to some other pieces.
I think for me, so much of what I reflect on in terms of, being efficacious in a space where, I might be offering an opinion, I think a lot really has to do with the relationships with the people that you're speaking with. And so very often, like, I've found that if I have good relationships with people, can offer certain opinions that may go contrary to, the dominant thinking, or contrary to their own opinions. And there can be a space for that. There can be a space for people to express dissensus, and to take into account different perspectives. But I think you made a really interesting point about like the hierarchy issue, and I even realized as I was saying like what I thought should happen in terms of incorporating considerations of racial justice and social justice into bioethics, I just realized I myself reflected a certain hierarchy. And so, perhaps maybe what we could think about is the idea of partnering with different sources of knowledge, different ways of knowing. So perhaps bioethics in some respects are related to certain problems, can pursue complementary knowledge from other fields, which may have developed in a different way. And it doesn't necessarily get around the hierarchy issue, but I think that making space for different ways of knowing, different backgrounds, different types of knowledge is something that can dismantle some of those hierarchies. It's just respecting people's knowledge for who they are and where they're at. I think you're muted.
So I'm going to take that example a little further down the road to touch on some of the pieces around when good intentions are not enough. So in the field of artificial intelligence, clinical care, and public health, not only do we have hierarchical implications for how decisions are made, who gets heard, who doesn't get heard, but we also have a dynamic business context in which artificial intelligence has reinvigorated the settler ideas of the Wild West. Often we're at meetings or conferences and people literally say it's the Wild West. And I often wonder if that's comforting, because as a person on Turtle Island, who comes from a particular set of histories of being, Black in diaspora, who's living as best I can as a treaty person on Indigenous land, those conversations about the Wild West are also conversations about taking what's not yours. They're also conversations about occupation, and they're also conversations about the cost that continues for Indigenous people, but somehow that becomes an acceptable statement. And so in artificial intelligence, especially in healthcare, it's very much treated like a monopoly game. And we have physicians primarily and other clinicians who are being invited through the academy's relationship with private institutions to, quote, innovate on their patients' bodies and on their patients' lives. And this is supposed to be seen as a good thing. And then we have the issue that I want to touch, which is the conflict of interest. So there's two here. One, as a bioethicist that is employed by an institution for whom you might have to give advice to that might not like it, how do you deal with that? And then when you couple that with an incident we have going on right now in Ontario and a couple other provinces where we have physicians who are active investors in startup and existing corporations who are, quote, giving trainings and workshops, not declaring any conflict of interest, and giving those trainings and workshops on the actual applications that they want other clinicians to use, and they're practicing clinicians. And so we get into this place where should bioethicists not be speaking up about this? Is this not an issue for you all to lead the charge? Because especially in the clinical context, this is where this, quote, innovation is encouraged. And so I know from people reaching out to Ready for Black Lives and from different conversations that people are deeply concerned about that conflict of interest and the fact that it's not being spoken to anywhere. And they're actually quite afraid. Like, what does it mean to be in a health system where my doctor is investing in something that actually doesn't take care of my constitutional rights, doesn't tell other doctors that they're enrolling into this schema, and is using me to think through their questions without my permission or consent? So can you help untangle that ball of yarn for folks who are like, so what are royals supposed to do? And invite your peers to think alongside you.
Yeah, I think this is exactly why we have international guidance and laws regarding human experimentation. Like, healthcare is not the space where you should be it's not the space where you should be trying things without proof that something is going to work. There's an evidentiary burden that needs to be met, and that has to be met through research, which involves informed consent. And so that consent piece, I think, is really, really crucial. And I think there is absolutely a space for bioethicists here. I think that's why it's important that, many of us, that we don't get too excited about and the new thing. And sometimes, I feel a little icky when people talk about what an exciting time this is. It's like, this isn't some super exciting thing to explore. This is something that is very, very serious and implicates real people's lives. And we already know that there's this huge problem in how it operates, and we have to take that responsibility very, very seriously. And I think that it really comes back to, like, the kind of guiding idea of this is really critical, which is intentions. And I think that's so important because I would be willing to wager that none of these people believe that, all of their intentions likely are to improve patient care. And the incentive structures in academia, in medicine, are set up such that we have this kind of, this individual glory narrative. And I think that's why people end up kind of trying to pursue, they want to do all the talks and they want to get the grants. And, like, I'm not excluding myself from that. I'm part of that structure, and so I know what the pressures are like. And I think that's why, bioethicists have had a piece in articulating the moral values that are at stake there, which is namely public trust or distrust, and some of the values regarding consent, the values regarding the evidence that's needed to move something forward, or even the amount of knowledge that you need to be justified in even doing research in the first place. So I think that absolutely we need to be advocating more strongly for an appropriate approval, for an appropriate process to follow, by which not using the AI needs to be part of that. It can't just be about, what do you need to prove to use this AI? It should also be, when do you not use this AI?
I want to take up some of the things you pointed out, and I think that some of them are really important. One of them around informed consent. So I think you may be familiar with the work of Lisa Boivin, and she talks about how consent works differently for Indigenous folks. And so when we think about that consent in different ways of knowing, it's not as simple as, let me give you a form and you read it and off you go. That there is collective consent and individual consent. Excuse me, I'm just going to put you on mute for a second. Allergy season is not cute. Excuse me. And so when we have consent and we butt that up against the incentivization process, the process that rewards clinicians for publishing, for bringing new things to market, that can get in the way though, right? Sometimes. And the space that I'm curious about for bioethicists is, how might you enter in? How might you interrupt that? And what are some of the challenges that you have?
I can speak to the research space, particularly because that's where some of my own background was. So we have rules, for example, through ethics approval for how to conduct research. So we know that clinicians typically are not the ones who should be getting consent from patients. It's a member of the research team. And they have to be introduced by someone who is known to the patient. You can't just walk up to a patient and ask them to participate in research, because we know that it can be coercive when a patient's own clinician is the one asking them for consent in research. And I think Lisa's work and your comments have really pointed out that something that I think there's variability in how well it's practiced, but some of the best practitioners that I know recognize that consent is not a one and done deal. It's not something that you sign the paper and now you're good. It is an ongoing process. It is checking in with the person. It is a dialogue, and it reflects the deep moral commitment that you have. And there's a lot of responsibility that goes with that.
I wanted to also circle back to something you said about why it's important to have an international framework, that there are a set of guidances for bioethicists and for clinicians, right? Particularly for doctors. And that it's important to adhere to those and to use a consent-based research process. But that gives us that challenge in artificial intelligence, that the vast majority of investment right now is to do non-consent-based research, right? So to gather as much data as possible, to place it into databases that any number of people will have access to, so that they can simply ask their questions without anyone else's guidance or input, but their curiosity as scientists at play. And so that means that's kind of research that's really being advocated for, and largely because that's what business does. Business collects massive amounts of information through a number of interfaces and search engines, right, and big data, and does with it and you as it will. And those practices have leaked in because of the private and public partnership. The two cultures have not actually drawn lines in the sand as they should. And so for those folks who are in the same places that folks like myself or Melissa are in these boardrooms where the private corporations and the public partners are together at the same table, not sharing their quarterly reports or their incentivization structures, but seemingly there to offer information and technical expertise. So we end up with this challenge where we want to talk about the guidance that we have, but that guidance is selectively practiced right now, right? And I think we've all been in rooms where we've been very uncomfortable, where we've had to take the risk and speak up and said, well, is this actually a priority for these populations, or is this a priority for the organization's reputation as an international innovator and the researchers within it? And sometimes there can be competing interests at heart. And so although there are these guidances, can you speak to what real power as a bioethicist or others of us have to address what we're consistently seeing, which is more and more private corporations in these intertwined partnerships without any proper declaration of conflict of interest, sitting at the table beside us and contributing as if they're equals, except they have a few $100 million that can make their decisions happen, whereas we're actually working at the level of the community or the population without that same kind of lobbying background. So what are some of the things that you struggle with and some of the things your peers have talked about? And I'd like you to ask or share with the audience what you want from the public to do your job better, right? Because we're not in isolation. It's the lives that are lived in the community that make health that you're often interpreting decisions on. So can you speak to that? What power do you have? How might the public help? And what are some of the interventions that you might want to encounter or try or inspire your peers to try?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to the first point, the conflict of interest issue is a really, really rich one. I am very, very much drawn to the scholarship of Daniel Goldberg, who is a US based public health expert. And so he talks a lot about divestment from industry as something that we should be moving toward. And I realize, every time I kind of bring this up, people are like, that's totally impracticable. But I really strongly, I believe that this is an important kind of direction. And if we don't at least consider it, then it's never going to happen. But what he points out to is that it is not so much, it's not always a matter of financial conflict of interest, but it is something about motivational bias. So even if you don't have, we talked about that incentive structure. So even being the lead researcher on something, you want it to succeed. And of course you do. Or you want this project that you've invested in, you want it to help patients. And so, he suggests that we think about those things as forms of motivational bias that might compromise our ability to see when things aren't working, to see when they might be harmful, might give us pause before reporting a harm. And so he talks about how even just disclosure of conflict of interest, sometimes that can actually increase trustworthiness, and people will say, oh, what a great person. They've disclosed that they have this conflict of interest, And so he says it's really not enough to do that. And we need to take steps to separate people's interests, to separate them from what's going on. And, we think about things like requiring independent ethics review, requiring independent legal review, and the extent to which we're able to comply with that within institutions, I think, is difficult. And so thinking through, what are some other structures that we could consider to try and enable some of that divestment? And then to your other point, Lana, I really encourage people to ask questions of their clinicians when they're there. Because clinicians will say to me, I have all these patients asking me if this is, what's happening here. And they bring that back. And then many places will have an Office of Patient and Family Experiences like we have here. And so they can also be a force where, they can represent the views of patients and families. And I think that the more we're asking questions, the more you're challenging these things, the more you're wanting to know this information, the stronger, the organization is going to recognize the need to provide that to you.
And I want to actually highlight some of the comments coming across the screen. And it's about patients, and the individuals also pointing out that in attempts to avoid some of those errors, they're reaching out to some of the very organizations that we know as insiders, so to speak, are also a part of the challenges that we're having. And so I want to kind of highlight here that there's also this piece around the fetishization of the patient. And so I think it's really important to talk about that, because oftentimes when one says, we're really concerned about the clinical applications, we're really concerned about the power imbalance, and we need to really work those things through, urgency, the imperative to respond now gets put on the table, and that doing these ethical, proper processes that allow for the respect of individuals kind of gets put to the side. And it gets put to the side often because there is a belief that the technology will have the answer. And so the technology performs this magical function of having answers and being the most urgent thing in the room. when we know actually there are many possible solutions, but those are being set aside. And so I put all that out there to kind of trouble the water around when patients are then brought into the process and said, oh, we want your feedback. There's an interesting thing that's going on there. And so, especially since you did say you did some work around, Black critical thinkers and Indigenous critical thinkers, we know that these two populations work at the level of collective, both by choice and also out of necessity, because racism doesn't allow for individuals to be present, right? It creates a kind of oneness, right? You don't get to be an individual Black person. You all of a sudden become a representative of all Black people, for better or worse. And so consent is not individual, participation is not individual, and being a patient brought in to do a particular kind of work because the cult of quality improvement wants to make sure they have the Black box checked, the disabled box checked, presents some bioethical concerns, because we know that as populations, particularly as Black folks, Indigenous folks, and especially when those folks are living at the intersection of disability and chronic illness, that there's actually a structural problem that's been specifically targeting. And so when we pull an individual out for whom their presence at the hospital is because they need support with illness, and then put them in a power dynamic where they're now, quote, the patient advisor to someone who has over 15 years of postgraduate training and out earns them by anywhere between $300,000 and $600,000, and who has the power to change their lives. We can see particularly how for Black and Indigenous folks, and for those folks living at intersections of disability, and folks who are gendered in other ways, that this patient piece is not actually a good answer. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because that is the conversations that I have heard and the conversations that I've been part of, where folks are like, this is a real appropriation of a people's movement by the hospital as a corporation, and it's disingenuous, and it sets people up to do a particular kind of work. And for those who are patient advocates that realize what's going on, as I've had people approach me, they feel very deflated because they realize that, in their own words, they've been used. And they've been used to undermine their own agency. And that really hit me after a talk when somebody came and said, I was one of those patient advocates, and it's really clear why they had me there. Like, really, how are we any match for that? We received no development. If we were to actually research the issues, which this individual attempted to do, she said, I was spending 20 hours just to try to grasp the fullness of the issue, and that wasn't being paid for. I wasn't being given a tutor. So how am I actually supposed to do that? And then I realized there were all these reports about what had happened to Black and Indigenous folks that nobody brought to the table. Why weren't the experts in Black and Indigenous studies at that table? Why were they pulling us patients? And I said, you have a really good question. I'm encouraging you to take that. And if you need help, I'll be more than glad to. So can you tell me about your experiences in that, and what can we offer your peers as well as other allied professionals and folks who aren't in the work that we do to kind of sort themselves through this kind of patient engagement fetish that has become all the rage, without acknowledging any of the harms it's been doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things is, like, when you think there's kind of a complacency with the assumption that if I recruit a diverse sample, I've done my job. Mm-hmm. And without, a really good understanding from people who are knowledgeable about, there are ways in which you should and should not go about doing that. And I think that you've exactly highlighted how you should not be going about doing that. And so even though, someone like me might know that I should recruit a diverse sample, I don't necessarily know how to do that appropriately. And so collaborating with other people who do, I think, is incredibly important. And then one of the things that, that really resonated with me that you said was, there was one point I was listening to, Kimberly Crenshaw has the African American Policy Forum. Mm-hmm. One of the topics of discussion at one point was the degree to which patients who are racialized feel pressure in clinical encounters to be a good patient and to have to present themselves in certain ways, and to say certain things and to not do certain things, and just the amount of pressure that's something that I myself have not experienced, and it's crushing to think about how much pressure people feel in that regard. And so, one of the things that I try to do in my own practice is to point this out to clinicians when, sometimes they're like, I don't understand why they can't just this, or I don't understand why they can't just that. And, I think that really we have to think about, not all of us are facing the same pressures when we walk through those doors of an institution, and being knowledgeable about that and respecting that, I think is something that we all need to get better at doing.
Thank you. I wanted to touch on a few other questions that we had offered to us. And one of them is about the concerns and criticisms that have emerged in the AI and bioethics discourse. And so there are some standing criticisms that are skirted continuously, but they're there. And there are also some thoughts that bioethicists have been discussing. And so I would love to hear your thoughts about the concerns and the criticisms about the direction of the AI discourse and how it's been dominated and by whom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the dominant discourse has come from corporations, which have recognized that, having ethics or having principles or values as part of their mandate looks good. It looks like they're doing the right thing, and so you hear like human-centered design or, social good. And, I remember Abiba Barani, who's a vocal critic in this space, has pointed out, every time you say values, I just think whose values? Mm-hmm. Whose values here? Because it's very easy to kind of hide behind values. And it's, part of being in bioethics involves exploring values and specifying which values are at stake here. So I think that that's kind of one of the main critics, is like how this has come from. And then even for folks engaging in the ethics space, and this is something that I always try to stay really cognizant of, is the way in which even ethics dialogue can be leveraged to continue to reinforce those values that are not necessarily representative of everyone. And I'm thinking particularly of Anna Lauren Hoffman's work here, where she points out how even feminist ethics discourse has been mobilized to kind of preserve hierarchical structures. And so, she points out that it's difficult to, when you really actually try and move toward justice, there is tension. And if you don't embrace that tension and try and push through, you're not actually going to be doing what you thought you were doing in the first place.
And I wanted to, in line with that piece around the whose values, I think this last, year or more in COVID has shown us whose values, right? So at the beginning of this pandemic, there was a whole lot of hype about what technology was going to do, how it was going to help. And what we actually found out was that technology hasn't actually really helped a whole lot. What we found out was that hundreds of millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of hours have been spent on apps that would have been better spent on ensuring that people could protect themselves by sheltering in place at home. And that we had apps that actually just produced anxiety and had no clinical or empirical evidence to support them. And that's unfortunately much of what goes on in AI. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that are being gambled literally, like health as a stock market, to bring forth technologies that no one asked for. And the people that are going to have that technology performed on them have not been asked, is this the way you want your time and money invested? Is this? So I often see doctors wanting to fix things who have no critical disability analysis and are spending inordinate amounts of time trying to perfect the human form. And they're actually engaged in eugenics. And when I have to say, we need to take a measured perspective, and have you actually sat down and talked to the folks that have a very strong analysis and are fine with who they are and understand that humans come in different packages and it's okay to have some chance in life, that everything isn't predetermined. And so the values of who we saw in the pandemic was really about who wanted to be able to do what they wanted when they wanted. So we saw that the vaccine technology got distributed to the people who had the lowest risk and the lowest exposure factors and the most privilege. We even saw just a few weeks ago here in Ontario where the Premier was advised to continue the long-awaited shift to making sure that the people who are being used to make profits are the people who get vaccines, who are being forced into these unsafe working conditions, continue to be vaccinated as they choose and want to be at accessible sites. And we saw people overwhelm the vast majority of testing clinics. We even had one in the West, in Brampton, that went around the clock, and they couldn't meet the demand. And so what we've seen is that the folks that actually should have the priority have been put last on the list. And when public outcry finally moved them to the front of the line, since they are the people doing the essential work, we've had an administration turn around and say, well, that's enough of that. Let's get back to the people that we think are important, which, let's be clear, they don't look like me. And that was even a debate, right? So folks were like, well, what do you mean we're actually having some success? Like, we had public health folks say, no, you need to make sure that they're vaccinated at the same levels, if not more so, because this is who you're sending out to do the work. And so we've seen how the technology of vaccines has skewed to the white, the wealthy, and the privileged. We've seen how the apps have been used to tag and stigmatize individuals. We've seen how the technology of transportation was not provisioned. Instead, the workers of long-term care facilities and the food establishments who live in areas that are affordable are still getting on packed buses. So we have oodles of technology, from the abstract to the practical, and we've seen it only exacerbate privilege of the privileged and drive people literally to their grave, right? As one physician said, she's not treated any white people because they don't have these jobs where they're being abused in this way, right? And so I want us to kind of come back at this question around the criticisms and concerns around AI and bioethics. So the current discourse is very much about all of the possibilities of what can be, even though we have hard evidence of what happens in the real world, right? So in the middle of a pandemic with thousands of Ontarians and thousands upon thousands of Canadians who have died, and a lot of it has had to do with who got that technology, the technology of being able to follow the actual advice. So there's a technology in there when you have the power to use the instruments, right, to execute what is good for you, right? So law is also a technology. We often just think about mechanical things, but technology are instruments that provide for a way of getting things done, right? So a hammer is a type of technology and it's a tool. So I'm going to ask you this question. Given the direction of AI and bioethics that has been dominated by the interests of highly incentivized clinicians, universities, and corporations, what are your thoughts about the material and the real world potential for artificial intelligence to deliver on its promise of making things better?
I'm pretty skeptical generally about, the potential of AI. I'll be very frank about that. The examples where it works well are few and far between, but I do know there are a lot of people who I think are quite serious about it, and there's sort of a shifting discourse right now where there is a recognition that we have to do everything differently, and AI is potentially a piece of that. So, it's not just about, like, I was kind of, this is maybe a side point, but I was kind of reflecting on what you mentioned about the shift in policy. Like, for a while, we were prioritizing high-risk people. And I think that there's something that happens that's similar to happening in the AI ethics space, is where justice and equity can be leveraged to further the dominant goals. I think they're incorporated. And then as soon as they kind of challenge that and challenge the status quo, then they get to be othered again. And then it's too extreme, or, it's not in line with the vision. And I think that part of the shift that in some spaces I'm hearing happen is that we just decide to prioritize different values. So maybe we don't prioritize accuracy. maybe accuracy is not the most important thing here. Maybe identifying, having greater clinical certainty is not the most important thing here. And so thinking through some of the other values that might be at stake, I think is really important. So thinking about when tools are being developed, and they're going to be used in a clinical space, we can look through what values are at stake. So if the technology is, suggesting a particular kind of treatment, we can know that is one kind of value. However, there are others that might be considered. So patient preferences, whether or not they are aligned with the goals of the clinician. So, I think someone mentioned saving the most lives is something that, was underpinning a lot of our pandemic response. But if we had shifted to, for example, preventing more infections, we would have had a bit of a different response. And so I think that what we need to move toward as AI bioethics generally has to be towards prioritizing different values and giving up some of the other ones.
So before we take some questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you to share, and you can take your time, not to rush, a little bit about your project that brought me to ask you to come on, because folks are always like, Lana, there's gotta be like a good example. And I'm like, I'm looking, because so much needs to be repaired, because so much has been poorly thought out, right? Because again, people often forget, I have to remind folks, artificial intelligence was never meant for health, nor for education, and definitely not for clinical care. This animal evolved from the relationship or the union between the Department of Defense and global finance. So go figure why we're stuck in a conundrum when you just try to slap it on everything. I mean, when the goal was to make money or to use it in theater of war, you can see why we have so many challenges repurposing it and trying to patriate it to the field of health. So can you tell us about the project that you worked on, and kind of give a little bit of background, like how you got to that project, and then tell us a little bit about what it does do, and what are some of the things that you found that were similar to the work that you've done, so that folks can kind of grasp the difference between what you've done and that I think is headed in the right direction versus the examples I'd have to give about what has been done and how it has gone in the completely wrong direction.
Yeah, so we got a grant from AMS Foundation to explore what will effectively be a scheduling assistant at SickKids. And so this work, Farzad Kalvati is our PI, and it was this was the idea. So Wayne Lee from our diagnostic imaging group, he basically knew anecdotally that it's very often that patients or families will miss appointments for reasons due to structural barriers. So he partnered with other people, including Karima Karmali from our Office of Patient and Family Experience, to try and think through how can we help families have better access. And one of the ways is through scheduling. So diagnostic imaging is a service at the hospital where patients are referred to assist in diagnosis or detect disease progression or different things, but it's the basis for deciding the next steps in care. So really timely access is important for at least from a medical perspective, determining optimal medical care. And so we know that, some families have more difficulties than others. They face more barriers than others. And right now our scheduling is pretty much done on there's the basis of urgency. But, we kind of sequentially put people into appointment slots as best we can, and families can certainly change them, but it requires, calling and rescheduling and different things like that. So this is really you could call this equal access to healthcare. So everyone who needs a scan can get an appointment. They won't be turned away. But what we really want to do is promote equitable appointment scheduling. So we're looking at data about people's access. So who is able to show up on time, who is late, who misses appointments, and trying to look at that data to try and detect some patterns. And on the basis of those patterns, what we hope to do is to use those patterns in a new tool that would offer prioritized appointments for particular patients and families. So ideally, at some point, this will involve looking to data that's provided from patients and families as well. For example, what is their work schedule? When can they come? When can they not come? How far do they have to travel? If you're traveling on the TTC, maybe you don't give them a 9 a.m. appointment. So essentially what we're hoping that this tool does is can enable the prioritization of particular families who face more barriers than others in order to promote more equitable access to these imaging appointments, and one that can, reflect their social realities.
And the next question I want to ask you kind of links into that. So this particular piece of software allows for a different kind of access. So can you tell us the difference between what this piece of software does compared to some of the other ones that are available, and how they might help or maybe not?
Yeah, so one of the value that we're trying to prioritize here is equity. But another value that is certainly at stake is efficient use of healthcare resources. And that's certainly been a value that's underpinned other scheduling tools. So we know that, missed appointments can equal loss of healthcare dollars. And so there's been quite a number of examples that have actually tried to do similar things where they try and predict no-show appointments. The thing is that those scheduling tools have tried to predict no-show appointments and then have double booked patients to those slots so that they don't lose money. And I'm sure you can kind of guess exactly which kinds of patients ended up getting double booked more so than others. And on top of that, it'll end up, some of the others have, gotten ready to offer a bill to patients who are going to miss appointments, or, can result in coercive practices like trying to call people, remind them. So I think, it's something that we have to remain cognizant of always to remain assured that we are prioritizing equity as a value, that there isn't that slippage into, well, what if we started double booking patients and save money? So, I think everyone on this group is really strongly oriented toward that equity. And we'd like to embed ways to make ourselves accountable to that as well. So it's not just a matter of, we developed this scheduling tool, now we're going to deploy it, which is a military term, as I'm sure you know, and just kind of let it keep going. And I'm sure it'll be fine. We want to make sure, we want to see how it's performing. We want to see what patients and families, are having their appointments prioritized, make sure that they are the ones that we have intended to prioritize. Is there anybody who's getting missed? Is there a way that we can change this to make sure that we're, capturing patients who maybe weren't included in that in the first place? And ensuring that we have some means of incorporating feedback from patients and families. So this tool, it could work really well on a technical level, but if patients and families either can't use it or don't have access to it, or, certain things just aren't working on their end, then it's going to be useless. So we need to make sure that that is a central part of the ongoing evaluation and monitoring process for this.
So just to sum up, so basically what your scheduling tool that the team is working on is designed to prioritize individuals and families who need a good variety of slots in order to both meet their obligations within their lives, work, family, challenges of transportation, and depending on where you're coming from, because at SickKids, there are people who come from outside of the province, from much further away. And what we know about the vast majority of the scheduling applications being used, especially in high demand offices and that are in the literature, are the penalizing kind. So if the person appears late, either the actual app does it or the person managing it marks that. And it then begins to change the kinds of appointments that they're even going to be made available. So I just want to clarify. So in the case of the literature that I've read and the peer-reviewed journals, these scheduling apps have caused serious challenges and are actually exacerbating illness at a population level. Because if systematically large institutions and small alike are purchasing these kinds of applications and they're running across provinces and municipalities, and as the case in the United States, across states and different regions, that's thousands of people who are being automatically shuttled out of access for no fault of their own, right? So, and then what we see is what we've always seen, which is the patient's the physician or the receptionist or whomever thinks are lovely. Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, we have a time slot. What would work best for you? That kind of custom treatment, again, gets placed with the haves and not with the have-nots. So the scheduling system you all are trying to implement is one that would actually do the opposite of the vast majority that are on the market, which is instead of penalizing the individual, it would look for a better fit, potentially, and prioritize those individuals because they're least likely to get what they need when they need it in a timely fashion. And that, folks, is why I asked Melissa to come, because the literature on scheduling apps is absolutely frightening, and the practice itself is actually producing a lot of clinical harm, especially in situations where you have illnesses being treated by in-demand specialists, right, who are only offering a few hours a week because they have surgeries and multiple commitments. And when you can't get there because, for instance, in this pandemic, the city of Toronto has decided that people that take the bus and do essential service should be crammed like sardines and increasingly exposed to COVID, while the bus routes that bus in their nannies are empty. We have a situation where people can't get to where they need, especially if they're coming from not the GTA and they have to take up residence somewhere affordable, which is going to be no less than an hour outside of an accessible range to a place like Sick Kids. And so I think it's really important that folks who are not in this work to understand that scheduling, you're like, oh, that doesn't sound really fancy, but you never will hear the words, the doctor can see you, if your name doesn't appear in the scheduler. And so we have a situation where we have highly skilled professionals, really fancy institutions, but then the people who need it most are often the people who the doctor won't see, and the doctor won't even know they're not seeing them because the algorithm will dispose of them in much the way that working folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks, and people living with disabilities have been disposed of during the pandemic. And I'm just gonna pull a little look at this piece across the bottom here. Appointment scheduling doesn't only impact folks with transportation and strict work schedules, but also folks with mental health needs, such as anxiety, depression, ADHD. And I think that's really important to acknowledge that, right? That there's a broad spectrum of folks. And I'm gonna share the next one. Can we comment on conflicts between Western ethical principles of client engagement and informed consent and those of diverse clients themselves? And the second part of that, for example, avoiding monetary compensation incentivization for client participation research based on the assumption that it will skew or influence the quality of data the clients provides. So this is a mixed bag, right? Because for a long time, folks have said, why do you keep taking the time of, quote, patients for free when all the people who are engaging with them are being paid inordinate amounts of money, right? They actually have lunch. They can actually pay for lunch. They have great salaries. And the folks that are coming in, especially if they're choosing from a representative sample versus the kinds that we typically have, which are the well-heeled and folks who are part of the white dominant culture, is that the balance is a bit of a challenge, because to not compensate folks in any way for their time is not okay. And non-monetary gifts kind of imply that it's an okay option instead of money. And I know when I've had this conversation in the real, meaning in the real world, with people who don't do this work, but who live their everyday lives, and the same question was brought. So would you want to have monetary compensation or not monetary? And the majority of folks are like, we don't want people who are going to spend their lives profiting off of our feedback paying us in gift cards. Like, it's gross. And I was like, okay, I hear that. And so, but for some folks, that might be better. What does that look like in your neck of the woods, and how is that grappled with as a bioethical issue? And how do you advise or interpret when something like that is put forward? Because I think that comment was very apt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it taps into some of the discourse that's been around research participation and incentivization for a long time, which, some large corporations can afford to pay people huge amounts of money to participate in trials. And so then bringing kind of those concerns into some of the spaces where we might be able to offer, $15 for your time. I think we have to think about, not pushing too hard against the massive compensation, but considering what would be appropriate compensation for people. So for example, if you're asking someone to participate in your research and they're going to, come and talk to you after their doctor's appointment, they're going to incur more parking costs for having stayed longer. And so, considering whether you're going to compensate them for their parking costs as a result of participating in your research, or maybe compensating them for the whole time that they've been in the parking lot, that can be something that we can consider. And where people kind of think about where should we draw the line is, where are we bordering into coercion? So in many cases in research, offering money, some people really need the money, and so they'll participate in research to get the money. Mm-hmm. And so, we have to think really carefully. It's tough because you also don't want to be paternalistic and say, oh, we don't want people to participate just for the money, so we're not going to give anybody any money. It is a really, really tough question. And I think that thinking through, you have to think that through, particular to the population that you are hoping to engage in research, and really having some means of understanding what would be meaningful to them. And maybe, where they think the lines of coercion might be, because maybe we don't know them.
Thanks for that. And I think what I like is that you pointed out that there's a number of different things to think through. We're going to be having some comments and questions rolling in. And I think that what it does lend itself to what you talked about is looking at what some of the historical relationships have been, right, to different populations. And here we have a comment that says, these studies are lucrative and make lots of money for stakeholders. What does it say that the ethical principles that shape these studies result in an exclusion of research people from any of the profit? And I think that this is where a lot of folks are becoming much wiser, right? And so I've had the privilege of working in different kinds of environments. And because I always keep it real, having real conversations with folks who haven't drunk any of the Kool-Aid. And they've said, I find it a little unseemly that I come to this big fancy hospital and everybody in their big fancy jobs, they don't even live anywhere near here. They don't live the lives we live. And we all know we're making them richer. And then they want to talk about a gift card and why don't you redistribute the benefits? Because many of these folks aren't even getting the benefits of good clinical care evenly distributed. So there becomes this larger lens that the camera gets pulled back. And this is by everyday folks, right? These are not folks who need to be getting a PhD to figure this out or go to health economics, at the graduate level. It's just really obvious. And so that's something that I'm wondering, do you hear a lot of conversation about that in bioethics, about the relationship between the long-term gains? And I'm thinking of a number of physicians in particular who are invested, who are not disclosing, who are doing trainings, who are trying to basically create a business without declaring that out of their patients' lives and out of the data they get to see and use without consent. And there is a goal, like that's why they're sinking that money in. Mm-hmm. And then they're accessing data without consent through databases and through EMRs. And have you heard bioethicists having those conversations with patient groups or amongst yourself and about what should be done?
Yeah, that's something that I've actually personally recommended a number of times, is when we're getting some money due to some AI tool or precision health or any sorts of things, how can we redistribute some of the profits on that? So perhaps going toward, so if we have to keep it internally, how can we actually use some of this money to prop up some of the programs who historically have more difficulty in finding funding? People who focus on race and gender issues, particularly, don't often get kind of the bigger pots of money. And so how can we redistribute some of those funds to assist with reprioritization of different research projects, I think is really important. And something that I also think is really important when we're talking about, people's health data, I really do believe that if we are using health data to explore topics, those benefits need to come back to individuals. And I think that it's tough to say that, oh, well, we'll make healthcare better, and so they'll benefit in that way. But that's far from a guarantee. And it's also, it relies on you getting sick to actually benefit, which is weird. So I don't necessarily have a great answer, but I believe very strongly in the idea of redistribution, because anytime you're amassing wealth in one area, I really do think we should be thinking about, well, how can we kind of bring this across to other people who have less?
And the redistribution piece brings us back to that theme of justice. So the title of this talk today was AI in Clinical Care When Good Intentions Aren't Enough. And I think what we've outlined is a number of concerns that point to us that while intention is one piece, impact is actually where it's at. And so we have a question here that says, can you speak to when and how bioethicists are engaged and how the questions are framed and who funds them? And I think the second part, maybe if you have time, is the part to focus on more, only because I know the first part's much longer answer. How proactive can or should bioethicists be in exposing and investigating this tech? That's the question I'm interested in, because some folks have said the bioethicists have been asleep at the wheel in this area. And so I'm not asking you to answer for all of your peers, but I am asking you to share what some of those conversations look like, both professionally and personally. So again, the question is, how proactive can or should bioethicists be in exposing and investigating tech?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to address the first point first, I will say that I'm sometimes brought into conversations right at the beginning. So a group will say, look, this is what we want to study. This is what we want to do. We know there's some things we need to be worried about here. We don't really know what they are. So what are they? And, you can have really great discussions that way. And you can really be involved in shaping that with them, suggesting to them, community groups to work with or to take their lead. And I think that those are the best examples. Sometimes you're kind of brought in at the end and they'll have developed something and then they're like, oh, it doesn't work. Please help. And so then, we can come in there, we can have that discussion. I'm glad you're coming to me. And then to the second point, like how proactive bioethicists should be engaged. I feel the sleep at the wheel comment. I think particularly with respect to the harms and not being critical enough. And that's something that, I honestly, I think I worry about that every day. I think I worry about that every time I'm trying to bring a critical lens. Am I going to look like a team player? Am I going to damage this relationship that I'm in? I think, generally I'm fortunate enough to say that most of the conversations that I've been in have been, productive, and there's a lot of people in this space who are really willing to engage in those discussions and hear that critique and be able to back off. And I know that that's not universal and it doesn't happen all the time. But I think that in as much as bioethicists, consider ourselves purveyors of, moral values and trying to articulate the moral values, if you have scientific processes that are really geared towards some values and not others, I think that that's an appropriate space for bioethicists to be speaking up and advocating for a larger set of values in the conversation.
I think we have a question here that has come up that is a perfect segue, like it literally bridges you. The answer you just gave. Can you speak more to the process of clinical activism? How do you bring up important but non-dominant values? And how do you navigate these conversations? Because you did say that there's times where you're like, will I, be disrupting this relationship? Will it remain whole by broaching? So what does clinical activism look like? Is it activism? Is it advocacy? Does it matter? Thoughts?
Yeah, wow. I think the first point is like sometimes I hear people kind of suggest a divide between like activism versus criticism, I guess, in an academic discourse. And for me, I don't see as much of a distinction. So I like the activism component. And I think that, if you're considering activism as, trying to strongly represent the values of groups or values that are not represented in dominant discourse, then absolutely, I think that activism is something to bring into the space. I think that we each kind of come with our own set of values, and that needs to come in. And how you actually bring, so sometimes people will specifically ask for them. They will want to know, they'll be aware that, there's a piece of the puzzle missing, and they want to know about what it is. For me personally, I try to look to the shared values. So, we all do want better patient care. I think that is kind of at the heart of it. And so if you talk to them about, well, look, you might get better patient care for some, but not all. And I don't think that that's what you really want to do. And I'm here to help you try and get to the all, not just the some. And it involves having difficult conversations. And so I think one of the most important things is that, ethicists, we can't be doing this alone. There's larger educational components in place. There's larger trainings and learnings and unlearnings that need to be happening, so that, because I hope that we end up, not being the only people to bring this into a conversation. I've had, like, in the past year, there have been lots of clinicians who have said to me, like, look, I know that I'm maybe not looking at this in the right way, and I don't really know how to look at it, but I know that this is important, and I don't know how to do it. And so, I think to some of the other educational offerings that are being provided to try and better recognize unconscious bias, racism, ableism, sexism, prejudice, I think that really interrogating those within ourselves, I think that people will be more ready to hear and incorporate those criticisms or suggestions that, go against what they've been trained to know.
And I think as we come to the close, I wanted to try to touch on a few questions that we had from the field. And here it goes. Do you think bioethicists in the Canadian context need to be more forthright about the limitations of their field? In this case, to push back on the co-optation of bioethics by big tech and big business, who use it to shield them from actually participating and succumbing to regulation, laws, and censure. And so to just repeat that, there's been a lot of work around ethics washing. So we've seen the big tech and big fintech firms and bio firms, we've seen a lot of money invested in lobbying. We've seen newspaper articles here in Canada about the high, extreme rate of lobbying going on in Ottawa and the kinds of contracts that are flying out the door unseen and unmanaged without oversight. That there is actually, a formal process that should happen when there's lobbying. And so we've seen when it comes to technology and particularly artificial intelligence in health, that ethics principles, ethics guidelines, ethics conversations, all manner of distraction in the name of ethics has been performed to distract, prevent, and actually silence bioethicists, clinicians, the people, when what we actually need to be talking about is regulation, law, and penalty. And so what do you say to folks that say, you know what, bioethics, I'm really disappointed because you don't speak back when these tools of distraction that undermine our human rights and our constitutional rights are being pushed, more and more guidelines. I was at a meeting, international meeting, where folks from the WHO and folks from Europe were presenting, and one gentleman did an entire piece around the number of ethics guidelines. And in 2019, we'd already hit 2,000, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and enforceability, zero. Accountability, zero. And so, but we do know is it took all of the world's attention away from regulation and away from policy that landed us perfect in the COVID pandemic for the abuses of power that we're seeing right now in technology. And so, to the question, what do you think bioethicists in the Canadian context need to do with regard to being forthright about the limitations of their field and speaking up about the co-optation of sometimes their own institutions of ethics to avoid doing the real work?
Yeah, I totally agree with you on the regulation and the law. I think those are critically important, and we have to recognize when ethical values are not enough. In many cases, they are not enough. They have to work hand in hand with law and policy and rights. And I think that the issue of like companies and institutions, I think, is a really difficult one, and that's where I come back to this idea of motivational bias, because I also, as much as I completely agree about, concerns about ethics coming from corporations, I also think of the work of people like Tumnit Jabru, Joy Buolamwini, Deborah Raji, and they have had just incredibly important work that has been so influential in the academic space. And for us, I think some academics will often kind of rest on their laurels and say, we're independent, we're not paid by a corporation, so we're objective and unbiased. And I don't necessarily think that that is true either in many cases. So I think that I have no easy answer for that, but I entirely agree that we need to be speaking up. We need to be recognizing where we may or may not be wholly objective, where we look to other sources of knowledge to complement our own. And I think, as you said, accountability is really, really key, because true to this session, good intentions are not enough. We need to be accountable.
And I wanted to kind of pick up on one of the things you said before I read the comment. And, it was a lead off of what I had contributed to the conversation about regulations and law. And last week we had a wonderful conversation with Idil Abdullahi and Nahal, and there were some great tensions there, right? And so we know that Black folks stand outside the law, and we can see that with all the extrajudicial killings, the violence, and we can see that Canada continues to embody its white supremacist roots when, an entire country has to have outcry to do the most basic thing as moving flags to half-mast, right? When 215 innocent children are found so far from home. And we can see again how white supremacy is unfortunately so present when someone can simply intentionally take the lives of an entire family. And so we see the hate crimes, and we see the ways in which we're not all considered equal, and we don't all get the benefit of the law. But, I also argue that corporations have no conscience, and without a line in the sand, it's very difficult to stop something, right? Because then you're left to your own devices, and these corporations have more resources, more muscle, and more power than most of us. So even though we're outside the law, these are tools that are still useful. And I always remind people, I get to be here today and speak in my own voice, unshackled, because my ancestors went against everything and made the law bend to them, even though they continue to try to deny us the protections that are right for every being on the planet, not just human beings. And so I'm going to read this comment, and it says, this person's in the US, ethics is girded by the common rule that was based on the Belmont Report, which wasn't tailored to non-white populations in white majority countries, and certainly not for Indigenous peoples. We are calling for ethics to be rebuilt from the ground up, for these populations because disruptive technologies are too powerful. And it ends with ethics, ethicists, and federal funders have to recognize that power. Is Canada working on that in comparison to the USA? So I'll let you kind of wade into that one first, and then I will join you.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think it's certainly important to consider how the kind of knowledge system that we rely on, I think we think because we've learned it, it is the knowledge system, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's not the only form of knowledge that's relevant here, certainly for the practice of ethics. So I know that, there are some folks in Canada who are really thinking through this thing that we call ethics, that we rely on. What's missing? What's not there? How do we redo this? And how do we change our education structures? It's certainly something that I'm very interested in learning. And I really look to the people who have that knowledge and have that background. I think it's really important. I really do.
And I'll wade into it as well. So are there people in Canada doing this work? Yes. That's part of why Ready for Black Lives has brought this to you. As someone who works in AI and met Melissa through my work in artificial intelligence, and particularly actually during a presentation on precision medicine, where I had to say, well, it's really great to be on this panel with you guys, but I'm going to have to disagree because all of your approaches are actually just trying to mitigate how white privilege functions in artificial intelligence and precision medicine. And you're not acknowledging that there's been 300 plus years of work that has denied whole populations of their humanities, where what has been written about us in peer-reviewed journals is absolutely awful for the vast majority of it, is actually empirically inaccurate and would not meet a really sound scientific review. But because we've stood and been pushed outside of the structures, it's been able to go forward. And so to the question, the reality is that when we think about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten and the need for a new kind of bioethics, we're actually talking about the need to make the world the place we know it ought to be, not the one produced by the violence of white European colonization, right? So humans have been behaving well and behaving badly for a long time, right? So I always like to remind people, but we're gonna talk about the last 500 years that gets us to this point. And there's a small group of people that were really invested in that process and are designing technology to do the same thing. And so just in closing of the comments we have here, and so Black and Indigenous bodies are in constant states of exception. Yes, they are, both as citizens and not, under punishment by the law, but not under its protection. And this is, I think, the change that we need, that we are looking towards a kind of jurisprudence that has more to do with the alignment and the language and the sentiments of the treaties that actually govern this place, which are far more sophisticated, far better developed. And most of that jurisprudence has actually stood for longer than Europe, right? As a place, as an entire place. And so there is a set of jurisprudence or legal or ethical thinking that can guide us. But there's also some tools to the comments, first questions, that can help. So I think that if we're going to go towards a new ethics, I think it needs to be tethered to a law framework that rebalances, right? And doesn't sit consistently in the hands and power of white folks who have created the problem we're trying to solve, right? So often with AI, what we end up with is a situation where it's like, oh, we're going to make it better. This is really going to help. And I'm like, okay. And then you're like, that looks exactly like the thing you did last time. You just added AI to it. And so it served only you last time and it will continue. And they're just like, oh, why? It's colorblind. And I'm like, and here we go again. So I think part of what's important to the comment and question that the person offered is that we need to do that work in Canada. There are those of us who are doing it. Has Canada as a country, as a federal country? No, we have Bill C-11, which is an absolute write-off. I mean, I encourage people to read the report by Citizen Lab on Bill C-11, and it is trying to push itself in. But for folks that actually look at the Constitution and Article 15 and actually look at human rights, C11 doesn't meet the most basic of tests. And so it's been refuted by folks who have pored over the books of justice versus the books of profitability, innovation for the few at the expense of the many. So federally, no, Canada's a disaster. Bill C11 is not our best work. And it has become actually a bit of a rallying cry for people who want a Canada that is in alignment with treaty, that is in alignment with the better things, that leaves off of the colonization, leaves off of economics and innovation at any cost. We've seen it cost us thousands of people's lives. We've seen whole families die during COVID because business was more important than taking care of the people who make that business possible. So federally, no. Right now, I'm working with a legal group and we're looking nationally at those laws and regulations. And so we have a lot of wanting, a lot of gaps, because a number of provinces are removing or changing their regulations and laws to allow businesses to do whatever they want. And so at first blush, what we have is primarily a setup for abuse of human rights at the provincial level and a rubber stamping it at the federal level. So again, I encourage everybody to pay attention to your life in the real, to make sure that you take a look at the legislation. And as we close out, I want to say thank you very much, Melissa McCraden, for coming and joining us and having a great conversation. I hope we've inspired some of your peers and the audience. And as we take it out, I want to remind us that our health is inextricably tied to the air we breathe, the land, our relationships with kin, human, flora, and fauna, and the degree we can navigate our lives unmolested and without fear. Too many creators of AI do not hold or protect the human rights that align with our treaty obligations, nor Article 15 of the Constitution. And while Black life and Indigenous lives and those who do not earn a lot of money with fancy titles often sit outside of the law and are punished by it, as many of you have pointed out, we need to change that system, and we need to make sure that artificial intelligence isn't continued to be weaponized against us, nor are we sold a bill of goods that is not grounded in the real, but that we collectively negotiate what should be prioritized, not from the hallowed halls of highly paid professionals in some of the fanciest hospitals in the first world on University Avenue and across the country, but that should be decided by the people who pay for those things, the everyday people. It should be in plain language. And you heard it here. We encourage you to come back, and we'll continue to give you information to make the kinds of decisions that allow us all to live well. Thanks a lot. See you soon.